There are decades that drift by like a quiet river, and then there are decades that shift the ground beneath your feet, subtly, slowly, but irrevocably. The 1880s was one of those turning points. It was a time caught between the fading shadows of the old world and the first flickers of the modern age. A time when street lamps hadn't yet pushed back the dark, but the spark was already there, humming faintly beneath the surface. Across America, whispers of change echoed in the clang of hammers, the hiss of steam, and the rumble of distant trains. Small towns clung to tradition, while cities stretched upward and outward, hungry for light, energy, and something new. And beneath it all, a quiet revolution unfolded, not in battles or proclamations, but in homes, factories, classrooms, and crowded tenements. Welcome to Sleepytown Radio, where the past is gentle, the nights are long, and every story is told as if the world isn't in a hurry anymore. Tonight, you're invited to settle in and drift back to the 1880s, a decade of invention and upheaval, of promise and hardship, of gold leaf opulence and coal-streaked hands. Here, the American landscape was reshaping itself, mile by mile, brick by brick. The nation was still young, just 38 states stitched together across a canvas of plains, forests, and smoky city skylines. Horse-drawn carriages clattered down muddy roads, while somewhere far off, Thomas Edison's first power station flickered to life. People still warmed their homes with wood and kerosene, yet advertisements promised a future lit by electric light. It was a time of great contrasts and quiet wonders, and for those who lived it, the decade didn't arrive with a bang. It crept in, like dawn through a frost-covered window, or the distant hum of a locomotive you can't yet see. A slow, steady unraveling of everything familiar. But it wasn't just machines that were changing. It was rhythm. It was pace. It was the way people thought about work, home, hope, and the future. Some welcomed it, others feared it, but no one escaped it. Tonight, we'll explore the world as it truly was in 1880s America, not through textbooks or grand headlines, but through the ordinary rhythms of everyday life. From crowded boarding houses and one-room schoolhouses, to ragtime melodies drifting through open windows, to letters written in violet ink and sealed with trembling hands. It all begins in the dark before the spark, before electricity changed the night, before the streets began to glow. So close your eyes, take a slow breath, and step gently back with us, back to a world still lit by flame, before the switch was ever flipped, before filaments glowed behind frosted glass, before cities lit up like constellations pressed against the earth. There was the night, and the night in the 1880s was a world of shadows and flame. Across America, when the sun dipped below the horizon, life didn't stop, but it did soften. Homes, stores, streets, all were cloaked in a deep hush, broken only by the steady flicker of gas lamps or the golden pulse of kerosene lanterns. In some homes, candles danced along parlor walls, casting gentle silhouettes on lace curtains and oil paintings. Others relied on open hearths or cast-iron stoves, glowing dim orange in the corner of a room, offering both heat and light in equal measure. Even in the largest cities, darkness held dominion. Street lamps burned with hissing gaslight, their reach limited and uneven. A walk down an avenue meant passing from dim halos of yellow into patches of complete blackness. The stars overhead were still visible, unobscured by artificial glare, filling the sky with a quiet majesty that few today can truly imagine. In rural towns and quiet farmhouses, families moved by memory. A single oil lamp might be carried from room to room. Children finished their lessons at the kitchen table, while parents mended clothes by lamplight. The shadows crept in early during the winter months, lengthening every task, slowing every step. It was a world lit not by certainty, but by care. People knew the rhythm of darkness. They respected it. Nightfall brought closure, stillness, and a kind of intimacy. Letters were written in low light. Music was played softly on upright pianos or fiddles by the fire. Neighbors gathered around shared stoves in boarding houses, or sat in silence on front porches, wrapped in thick shawls, listening to the chirp of crickets and the hush of wind through trees, and in that hush the world felt timeless. But beneath the flickering calm, something was stirring. In a small corner of Manhattan in the year 1882, the Pearl Street station began to hum. Powered by a steam engine and conceived by a man named Thomas Edison, this was the very first central power plant in the United States. It didn't look like much, just a few blocks of lower Manhattan. But inside, dynamos spun, copper wires hummed, and a new kind of light was born. Not the soft flutter of a candle, nor the hiss of gas, but a steady, unwavering glow. White, clean, controlled. At first, only a handful of buildings flickered to life. Storefronts and offices glowed faintly through their windows, drawing curious onlookers from the street. Crowds gathered at dusk to catch a glimpse of what many called a miracle. Light that didn't need tending. Light that didn't die in the wind. For those who saw it, the feeling was hard to describe. Awe, wonder, and a quiet sense that the world had just changed. But it didn't happen overnight. For much of the country, the 1880s remained a decade of duality. Some towns embraced the electric grid, wiring their hotels, banks, and theaters with bulbs and switches. Others continued to live as they always had, by flame, by habit, by the rhythms of generations past. And even in cities that adopted electricity, the transition was uneven. One street might shine with incandescent brilliance, while the next remained cloaked in gaslight and soot. Households were cautious. Electricity was new, mysterious, and sometimes frightening. There were tales of fires, sparks, shocks. People weren't yet sure if it was magic or danger, yet progress crept forward. Factories began installing electric motors, replacing belts and pulleys that had once clattered endlessly from ceiling beams. Streetcars, once pulled by horses, began to glide silently down tracks powered by unseen currents. Entire industries began to shift, not just in how they worked, but where they could operate. No longer tied to rivers or coal deposits, factories could now open wherever electricity could reach, and reach it would. But in those early years, for most families, nightfall still meant firelight. It meant sitting close, speaking softly, and letting the dark wash over the walls like a tide. There was something deeply human in that simplicity, something fragile and warm. Many would look back on it years later with unexpected longing, because when the electric light came, when it truly came, it didn't just push back the darkness. It changed the very shape of evening. It extended hours, invited activity, erased boundaries. It made work longer, life faster, and nights shorter. But before all of that, before the world turned bright, there was a moment, however brief, when light and dark existed side by side, when a single glowing bulb was a marvel, when the unknown still whispered at the edge of the lamplight. It was in that moment the country stood, one foot in the old world and one stepping toward the new. And while the lamps still flickered, the engines had already begun to move. As the light began to spread, so too did the rails. In the 1880s, the railroad wasn't just a mode of transportation. It was a symbol of movement, of hope, of the belief that the vast, wild heart of America could be stitched together with iron and steam. From coast to coast, the land rumbled with the sound of progress. Engines howled across prairies, through mountain passes, and into growing towns that hadn't existed a decade earlier. Wooden depots rose along the tracks, some no bigger than a tool shed, others bustling hubs of life, filled with arriving dreams and departing goodbyes. At dawn, smoke from early trains curled into the sky like ghostly fingers. The shrill whistle pierced the morning fog, announcing its arrival long before it reached the edge of town. Children would stop playing just to watch it thunder by, eyes wide at the speed, the power, the sound. Horses shied away, wagons paused, and everything stood still for a moment as the great engine passed. Inside the cars, passengers watched the countryside blur past. Fields of wheat, stretches of pine forest, lonely water towers, and distant farmhouses. For some, it was the first time they'd ever left their hometown. For others, it was the journey toward a better life. Westward or eastward, chasing opportunity or fleeing hardship. What once took weeks by wagon could now be done in days. Kansas to New York, St. Louis to Chicago, San Francisco to Omaha. The iron roads flattened distance, stitched together time, and rewrote the American map. The experience of travel changed too. No longer were journeys defined by hardship and dust. Now, there were velvet seats, dining cars, and sleeping berths. Attendants moved quietly between aisles, offering coffee or small talk. In the evenings, the lights inside glowed warmly as passengers read books, played cards, or simply stared into the darkness beyond the glass. And yet, for all its elegance, the railroad was not always gentle. In the small towns and lonely homesteads that the rails bypassed, life remained isolated. Some feared the train's speed, its noise, its disruption. Others saw it as the arrival of something too big, too fast, an end to the quiet they had once known. But for many more, the railroad was life itself. It brought mail, news, medicine, tools. It brought relatives from far away and carried soldiers off to service. It delivered sacks of flour and barrels of pickles. It brought catalogs from Sears and letters from home. Towns without a station were soon forgotten. Those lucky enough to sit beside the tracks flourished. Hotels were built. General stores opened. Telegraph lines followed the rails like twin veins of copper and steel. And where the trains went, so too did the future. Railroad workers became a world unto themselves, tough men in overalls, carrying lunch pails and grease-stained tools. They laid track through blistering heat and blizzards. They repaired switches and bridges, lived in mobile camps, and learned to trust the rhythm of the engine more than any clock. Conductors in crisp uniforms announced destinations with calm authority. Engineers, their hands on the throttle, felt every tremor in the track like a whisper. Brakemen climbed across the tops of moving cars, silhouetted against the sky, and always there was the sound, the low hum of steel wheels on rail, the distant horn echoing across fields, the click-clack that lulled passengers into sleep. It was the heartbeat of a growing nation, steady, relentless, and full of promise. At night, towns would listen for the last train, its whistle a lullaby, a reminder that somewhere out there, the country was still moving, still changing. By the end of the decade, America would boast over 160,000 miles of railroad track, more than any other country in the world, and each mile told a story of men and women on the move, of cities rising, of possibilities unfolding. It was not just a change in how people traveled, it was a change in how they dreamed, because now the world was not just outside the front door. It was a ticket away, a timetable away, a chance away. And with every train that departed, the horizon grew a little closer, just beyond the platform, beyond the polished rails and wooden ties. A new kind of America was waiting, and it was coming fast. In the wake of the railroads, something else began to rise, brick by brick, beam by beam, from the once quiet edges of America's growing towns and cities. It was the sound of progress, but no longer the rolling thunder of train wheels. Now, it was the clatter of gears, the rhythmic pounding of steam-driven pistons, and the distant hum of industry taking hold. In the 1880s, America entered an age of machinery. Factory walls loomed where fields once lay. Brick chimneys pierced the sky, trailing long ribbons of smoke that turned sunsets the color of rust and soot. The air hung heavy with the scent of iron, oil, and ambition. Streets filled with wagons carrying crates of tools, barrels of chemicals, bolts of cloth. And somewhere inside those crowded buildings, people worked. They came by the hundreds, men, women, and even children, drawn from farms, from distant countries, from smaller towns that offered fewer chances. The city promised wages, and wages meant survival inside the mills and foundries. Time was no longer measured by the sun, but by the shift. Whistles blared at dawn, signaling the start of another 10 or 12-hour day. The machines were loud, constant, unyielding. Leather belts turned overhead. Flywheels spun. Sparks flew. There was no silence. Only the relentless beat of a nation building itself from the inside out. It was hard, dangerous work. Fingers were lost to looms. Eyes burned from fumes. Accidents were common, protections rare. And yet, the pay, however modest, was steady. For many, that was enough. A new kind of rhythm settled into American life. Weekdays belonged to the factory. Sundays were for church, washing clothes and sleep. Families adjusted to the cycle, learning to rest in the brief moments between shifts, to laugh in the glow of a kerosene lamp, to find pride in a week's worth of blisters and coin. Cities like Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Detroit swelled with workers. Neighborhoods grew around mills. Boarding houses rose fast, their walls thin and their rooms crowded. Smoke darkened the paint on every surface. The clang of trolleys and factory bells filled the air. But to those who had known hunger and war in faraway lands, The noise sounded a lot like opportunity. The American dream, once rooted in land and liberty, began to reshape itself in the furnace of industry. Success was no longer a plot of farmland, but perhaps a supervisor's badge or a home with glass windows. Owning a clock, sending a child to school, buying a wool coat before winter, and as factories grew, so too did the divide. Not all Americans shared in the promise. While workers labored long hours for pennies, a new class of wealthy men began to emerge. Industrialists with names like Carnegie, Morgan, and Vanderbilt. Titans of steel, oil, and finance, they built empires from soot and sweat. From their mansions, they could see the city skyline, not just smoke and rooftops, but symbols of progress they had come to control. Still, inside the mills and warehouses, life went on. Lunchtimes brought a moment of pause. Tin lunch pails filled with bread, pickles, maybe a slice of cold meat. Conversations drifted in a dozen languages: Polish, Italian, German, Yiddish. Workers swapped jokes, letters from home, dreams for the weekend. Then the whistle blew again, and the machines roared back to life. The rhythm of industry was like a second heartbeat. And at night, when the fires inside the furnaces dimmed, the workers walked home under lamplight. Their boots scuffed the cobblestones. Their hands bore the proof of labor. But their eyes, tired as they were, still carried a quiet kind of hope. For better or worse, the rise of industry was reshaping America. It would change the way people lived, the way they worked, and the way they dreamed. From the smoky silhouettes of the factories, eyes sometimes turned upward, toward the towering offices, the lavish mansions, and the names that commanded them. Names like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, and Edison. These were the titans of the Gilded Age, captains of steel, oil, finance, and invention. Their vision for America was vast, and their hands were everywhere. Andrew Carnegie, born poor in Scotland, rose to dominate the steel industry. His mills powered railroads and skyscrapers alike, forging the literal skeleton of a rising nation. John D. Rockefeller, with his Standard Oil empire, refined crude into wealth, creating a system of pipelines, trusts, and monopolies that reached into every home. J.P. Morgan, calm and calculating, moved money like generals moved armies, orchestrating the flow of capital with an iron will. And Thomas Edison, ever the inventor, filled notebooks with dreams and laboratories with light. Their wealth was staggering, their power unthinkable, and yet, for the people below, they were both awe-inspiring and unreachable. To many factory workers and immigrants, these men symbolized the promise of America, that one could rise from nothing, that boldness and brains could change the world. But to others, they were the new aristocracy, cloaked in capitalism instead of crowns. The contrast was sharp. While some dined on silver, others boiled potatoes in tenement kitchens. While the tycoons spoke in boardrooms, their workers shouted over the roar of machines. Newspapers praised their success, but labor unions began to form, whispering of strikes, of fairness, of rights. Yet still, the American dream endured. It was not just a rags-to-riches story told to children. It was a belief that effort could lead to more. That beneath the layers of soot and sweat, every man held the blueprint to something better. Perhaps not a mansion, but a roof. Perhaps not a fortune, but a future. Children were named after Edison. Workers quoted Carnegie. Inventors dreamt of rivaling Bell. The tycoons loomed large in the public mind, half villain, half myth. And behind every newspaper article and oil barrel was a question. What did success really mean? Was it riches, influence, a legacy? Or was it something quieter? A full belly, a safe bed, a letter home. As the decade pressed on, the nation would grapple with these questions. But for now, steam still rose, factories still whirred, and across the harbor, a figure began to take shape in copper and torchlight. Something new was coming, a silent symbol, a promise cast in iron and flame. It would not speak, but it would be seen, and for millions it would mean hope. And just ahead, past the smokestacks and soot-stained walls, stood something tall, silent, and waiting. A figure in the harbor, a torch in her hand. The next chapter of the American story was coming, and it began with a whisper across the Atlantic and a promise in the fog. As steamships crept toward the shores of New York Harbor in the late 1880s, passengers lined the rails, their eyes straining through the morning haze. Some clutched weathered bags and bundles. Others held children close to their coats, afraid to believe that this new land might truly offer what the old one could not. And then, through the veil of fog and coal smoke, she appeared, tall, still, shining faintly in the rising sun. The Statue of Liberty. To many, she seemed less like a structure and more like a vision. A woman of copper standing with one foot forward, arm raised, torch in hand, as if she were lighting the way not only for ships, but for dreams long held and never quite spoken aloud. She was a symbol sent from across the ocean, crafted in France, assembled in America, but to those arriving from Italy, Ireland, Germany, or Poland, she was neither French nor American. She was universal. She was hope. Below decks, the last passengers stirred. They rose and pushed toward portholes or climbed steps to catch even the faintest glimpse of the statue. People murmured prayers in many languages. Some wept openly. Others stood silent, stunned by her presence. As though a goddess had emerged from the sea, she stood on Bedloe's Island, tall above the harbor, welcoming the world's tired, poor, and huddled masses, not with grandeur, but with grace. To the wealthy and powerful of the time, she was a marvel of engineering and diplomacy. To politicians and city planners, she was a gift of friendship and progress. But to the working man, the farm girl, the widowed mother clutching a child, she was something else entirely. She was a lighthouse without a beam, illuminating not the sea, but a path forward. A silent witness to millions of new beginnings. For some, this would be the closest they would ever come to her. They would pass by on the boat, take one long, final look, and move on, into the city, into the tenements, into the unfamiliar unknown. For others, she would become a memory etched in the mind forever. Years later, they would tell their children, "We saw her. We saw the lady with the torch. She watched over the harbor through snow and summer, through war and peace, her copper skin weathering into soft green. She never moved, never spoke, but she said more with her stillness than any banner or slogan could." Even as the ship pressed on toward Ellis Island, toward the long lines and inspections and paperwork that awaited, passengers lingered at the rails, trying to memorize the shape of her face, the folds of her robe, the glow of her golden flame. For in that brief moment, They were not immigrants, not strangers, not statistics on a ledger. They were dreamers, and she, the lady in the harbor, was their first promise that dreams might yet be real. The ship slowed as it entered the upper bay, its iron hull slicing gently through the morning tide. A hush fell over the deck, not from silence, but from awe. Men removed their caps. Mothers lifted their children so they could see. All eyes turned toward the horizon, where, rising out of the fog, the Statue of Liberty stood tall. Just beyond her, a small island waited, Ellis Island. From a distance, it looked like little more than a collection of brick buildings sitting on a sliver of land. But for millions, it would become the gateway to everything they had hoped for, and everything they feared. As the immigrants disembarked, they carried with them the scent of the sea, the weight of long journeys, and the quiet prayers tucked into coat pockets and bundled in hand-stitched satchels. Fathers gripped immigration documents with trembling fingers. Mothers clutched children close. Their shoes tapped against the wooden dock, hesitant yet hopeful. Inside the registry building, the ceilings arched high like cathedrals, but the air felt crowded, thick with accents, with questions, with worry. Lines wound around the room like slow-moving rivers. Inspectors waited at long tables, their uniforms tidy, their expressions firm but not unkind. Interpreters darted between them, trying to bridge the gap between dozens of languages and one common goal. Entry. One by one they stepped forward. Names were asked, then shortened or misspelled. Eyes were checked for trachoma. Hearts pounded during the brief, silent pause after the examiner's final nod. Would they be allowed through or sent back? Some were detained, pulled aside for further questioning. A family might be separated for hours, sometimes for days. But most passed, often with nothing more than a chalk mark on their coat and a firm wave toward the next corridor. In one corner, a young boy clutched a small violin case. He had played for coins in the streets of Naples. Now, he stared wide-eyed at a country that didn't yet know his name, but might someday know his music. Nearby, a girl with ribboned braids whispered to her mother in Yiddish. She had dreamed of eating fresh fruit and going to school. Behind her, a man from Ireland whispered a silent promise to the wife he had buried before the journey, a promise to begin again. And always the windows. Tall panes of glass lined the walls, letting in light that fell gently across the floorboards. For many, it was their first glimpse of sunlight in America. A light filtered not just by glass, but by the stories of those who had come before. Ellis Island was not grand. It was not glamorous, but it was sacred in a quiet sort of way. It was where new lives began, not with parades or handshakes, but with signatures, medical checks, and deep, grateful breaths. By afternoon, the waiting room had thinned. Names had been called, papers had been stamped, and one by one, they filed toward the ferry that would take them across to Manhattan. The skyline was still distant, hazy and unreal, but their feet moved forward step by step. The journey was not over, not yet, but for the first time, they were on American soil, and that was enough, for now. As the ferry pulled away from Ellis Island, the skyline of Manhattan rose slowly in the haze, its rooftops and smokestacks like jagged teeth against the pale sky. For many newcomers, this was the moment hope turned to reality. They were in America now. But what lay ahead was not always the promise they had imagined. The city was alive with motion. Horses clattered over cobblestones. Steam hissed from the grates. Children darted between wagons, shouting in different tongues. From the docks, families followed the flow into crowded neighborhoods where others like them had already settled. Germans, Italians, Poles, Irish, Russian Jews. People from everywhere, all searching for the same fragile thing, a place to belong. The tenements stood tall and narrow, side by side like stoic sentries guarding a life that was never quite easy. Built quickly and cheaply, these buildings were packed tightly onto city blocks, each one a maze of rooms and staircases and shadows. The brick walls were stained with soot. The wooden steps creaked with every footfall. And yet, behind every door, there was a story. Families lived shoulder to shoulder in rooms no larger than a modern kitchen. A single space might serve as bedroom, dining area, and parlor all at once. A stove in the corner provided heat when there was coal to burn. Mattresses were shared, sometimes by shifts. When one father returned from the night shift at the mill, another would rise to begin his day at the factory. Privacy was a luxury, and silence was rare. Children cried. Babies were born. Grandparents passed away, sometimes in the same bed where generations had slept before them. The air smelled of boiled cabbage, kerosene, and sweat. It was loud. It was cramped. But it was home. Down the hall, a mother scrubbed laundry by hand, her fingers raw from the cold water. A boy crouched near the window, tracing letters on the fogged-up glass, dreaming of school. From the alley outside, a vendor shouted in broken English, selling bread from a cart that had seen better years. Shared toilets lined the back of the buildings, each one used by dozens. Water was drawn from a spigot at the corner and carried up 4, sometimes 5 flights of stairs. In the summer, the heat inside the tenements was suffocating. In the winter, the walls froze to the touch, and yet, in spite of everything, there was life here. On Saturday nights, someone would play a fiddle in the courtyard, and children would dance in circles until the sun went down. Women leaned from windows, calling across the alley in their native languages, passing gossip and comfort in equal measure. When one family fell ill, another brought soup. When a baby was born, the neighbors brought candles and coins. Strangers became kin, bound together by hardship, but also by hope. The men and women who lived in the tenements worked hard, too hard. Many labored 10, 12, even 14 hours a day in sweatshops, textile mills, or steel foundries. The pay was meager, and conditions were brutal. Fingers blistered, backs broke. But the paycheck, however small, kept food on the table and a roof overhead. It wasn't just the work, it was the sacrifice. Parents often went without so their children could attend school, even briefly. Young girls took in sewing at home. Boys sold newspapers on street corners. Every nickel mattered. Every meal was a triumph. Sometimes, on a rare Sunday morning, a father would sit with his family by the window, watching the city wake up. They would sip weak coffee and break bread slowly. In that moment, time seemed to soften. The noise of the streets faded, and for a little while, they felt almost still, almost safe. Beneath the hardship was something that pulsed quietly, like a heartbeat beneath the noise. It was the dream, not the kind found in books or promised by politicians, but the quieter kind, the one whispered between parents late at night. The belief that someday their children might know something better, that these dark hallways, this shared bed, this crowded building would be just the beginning. Outside, the city pressed on. More ships would come. More families would arrive, and the tenements would stretch to hold them, brick by weary brick. But inside, behind those faded doors, life unfolded with remarkable grace. There were lullabies sung over crib boards, prayers murmured by candlelight, letters from the old country read aloud, then tucked away in drawers, laughter over soup, tears over losses, and through it all, an unspoken strength that held the walls up when nails and mortar couldn't. The tenements weren't built to last, but the people inside them, they endured, and somehow, in that endurance, they built the foundation of a nation that still tells their story. In the growing cities of 1880s America, childhood took on a very different rhythm, faster, harsher, shaped by necessity rather than nurture. For the sons and daughters of immigrants and the working poor, the city was not a playground. It was a place of obligation, a place where tiny hands often learned to toil before they ever learned to write. As the sun rose between tenement rooftops, it touched the faces of children already awake, some preparing to hawk newspapers on street corners, others buttoning up worn clothes for a day inside the textile mills or match factories. They were called newsies, mill boys, and bobbin girls, but they were just children. Children who knew the rhythm of whistles, the weight of coal dust, and the sting of adult responsibility far too soon. In neighborhoods like the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where every floor of a crumbling tenement held a different language and dream, children filled the sidewalks, selling apples, running errands, collecting scrap metal. It was not unusual to see a 5 or 6-year-old watching younger siblings while the parents worked 14-hour shifts. The streets taught them how to speak up, how to barter, and sometimes how to run. But even in this hardened world, there were moments that softened. Chalk drawings decorated the pavement where girls played hopscotch when no one was looking. A tin can became a soccer ball passed between shoeless feet. Laughter still found its way through alleyways, fleeting but fierce. Public schools existed, yes, but for many working-class children, education was a luxury rather than a right. Attendance was irregular at best, interrupted by work, illness, or family need. Still, there were teachers who made a difference, who lit a lamp of curiosity in a child's heart, even if only for a few hours a week. A lesson on geography might transport a child from the smoky brick walls to open green fields, if only in imagination. Child labor reform was still decades away from meaningful change. In the 1880s, laws varied from state to state, often poorly enforced. Some factories proudly employed children because their small fingers could work the machines faster. Others simply looked the other way. Organizations like the Children's Aid Society began to notice. They offered shelters, evening schools, and the promise of a different path, sometimes sending orphaned or abandoned children westward on so-called orphan trains to be placed with families. The idea was well-intentioned, though not always tender. Not every child found kindness at the end of that journey. Through it all, the children endured. They carried lunch pails filled with bread crusts and hope. They learned to navigate crowded trolley lines and slippery cobblestone streets. They became translators for their parents, protectors of their siblings, and witnesses to a changing nation. And yet, they still dreamed. Some dreamed of becoming storekeepers, seamstresses, train conductors, or maybe teachers themselves. Some dreamed simply of more food, more time to play, more sunlight on their faces that didn't come filtered through factory windows. Even now, if you walk through certain corners of old American cities, you might still hear their echoes, children calling out headlines of the day, skipping stones down a quiet alley, or singing songs in broken English on a fire escape at dusk. Their stories were never printed in the papers they sold, but they lived on, in the strength of neighborhoods, in the evolution of labor laws, in the quiet dignity of a generation that grew up too fast. And as the city lights begin to flicker on, one can almost imagine a little figure in the distance, barefoot, determined, with tomorrow's dreams tucked inside today's small hands. In the 1880s, the streets of American cities moved to a different rhythm, a slower, steadier one shaped by the steady clop of horses' hooves and the creak of wooden wheels over cobblestone. There were no car horns or engines revving. Instead, the air was filled with the sounds of leather harnesses jingling, iron shoes tapping against stone, and the soft murmurs of conversation as people passed one another on foot or by carriage. Horses were everywhere. They were the lifeblood of the city, pulling streetcars and delivery wagons, hauling barrels of milk and crates of ice. Every morning, as the sun filtered between brick buildings and gas lamps flickered out, the first hooves began their steady beat, pulling carts loaded with fresh bread, coal, or produce from nearby farms. A city waking up sounded like animals at work. The roads were wide but often uneven, a mix of dirt, stone, and, on rainy days, mud that clung to boots and carriage wheels alike. Children played between the wagons when traffic slowed, weaving through clusters of pedestrians and horse-drawn carts. They learned to leap over puddles and hop between stepping stones, all while keeping a watchful eye for the great draft horses that towered above them. There was a particular smell to the city then, not unpleasant, but undeniable. A mix of hay, manure, sweat, coal smoke, and something sweet drifting from a bakery or a fruit cart. In the winter, the scent of wood fires curled through the streets. In the summer, the city buzzed with flies and the occasional sharp tang of a blacksmith's forge. Each block had its own feel. In some neighborhoods, polished carriages rolled past elegant homes, driven by men in crisp jackets and gloves. In others, heavy drays clattered past rows of tenements, their drivers calling out warnings to clear the way. Horses paused at water troughs positioned on street corners, steam rising gently from their backs in the cooler months. Children loved to gather there, tossing pebbles into the water, running their fingers through the surface while their mothers hurried along with baskets in hand. Street sweepers came through with brooms and carts to clear away the messes left behind. An endless task, but necessary to keep the walkways passable. When it rained, the streets turned slick. Wagon wheels would slide. Horses could stumble. People knew to walk carefully, not just to avoid falling, but to protect the hems of their garments from the muck. Umbrellas bloomed across the avenues like slow-moving flowers. And above it all, a maze of telegraph wires stretched from pole to pole, humming with distant voices. The city felt alive, organic and intimate. Everyone was close, to the ground, to their neighbors, to the work they did with their hands. The distance between home and market, school and church, was walked rather than driven, and so time moved differently. Slower, perhaps, more deliberate. In the evenings, the streets quieted. The busiest wagons returned to their stables. The drivers, weary, brushed down their horses and fed them hay by lantern light. Storefronts dimmed. Children were called indoors, and the last echoes of hooves faded down narrow lanes. The gas lamps hissed to life, casting golden pools on stone pathways, and the city shifted into something softer, less hurried, more reflective. For many, the street outside their tenement window was the only view of the world they had. It was where deals were made, where gossip passed between neighbors, and where children watched the world grow one load of bricks, one barrel of apples, one delivery of coal at a time. It was noisy and dirty, but it was also vibrant, full of stories. And somewhere in the crowd, a young boy might press his face against a shop window, gazing at a model train or a pair of polished shoes. A girl might pause to pet a horse and whisper to it before running to catch her mother's hand. Life happened in plain sight, moment by moment, with all its hardship and all its quiet magic. This was the world before engines, before cars would change the city's shape, its speed, and its scent. A world where the streets breathed with the steady rhythm of hooves and the quiet resilience of people finding their way, step by step. The city streets, once dim and flickering under the hush of gas lamps, were changing. Evenings had long been a ritual of routine and shadow. Lanterns trimmed, wicks lit with a practiced hand, the scent of kerosene lingering in narrow hallways. In those final hours of the day, people read by trembling light or sat quietly, letting the silence fill the corners of their homes. But in a laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, a man with untamed hair and tireless hands was chasing something new. Thomas Edison, part inventor, part dreamer, and entirely restless, worked through nights that never ended, testing and failing and testing again. They called him the Wizard of Menlo Park, and in many ways, he was. Not the kind of wizard found in books, but one who dealt in filaments and glass, in copper wire, and stubborn resolve. His light bulb didn't just glow, it promised a future. When electricity came, it didn't shout, it whispered. It began in small rooms, in select corners of town, where wires ran along ceilings and switches clicked with a quiet certainty. At first, it felt strange, the steady glow without a flame, the absence of smoke or scent. But then, slowly, it became something else, a quiet kind of miracle. Storefronts stayed open a little longer, factories buzzed deeper into the night, and neighborhoods once wrapped in darkness began to shine. Children pressed their faces to window panes, eyes wide with wonder as the streets lit up, steady and gold. No more trimming wicks or refilling oil. No more shadows dancing on the walls. The night, once an ending, became something else. A continuation, a second act. Edison's invention didn't just change how people saw. It changed what they could imagine. In homes, women sat stitching with ease, their needles catching the light as they moved through fabric and thread. Fathers read newspapers in full clarity, while children turned pages of picture books without squinting. Conversations lasted longer, meals stretched out in warmth, and the quiet hum of light became part of life. Of course, not everyone had electricity. In 1880, it remained a luxury, a curiosity. The poor tenement buildings downtown still relied on candles and coal, but the glow was spreading inch by inch, wire by wire, and with it came hope. Hope for longer hours of learning, hope for safer streets, hope for a world that didn't disappear when the sun went down. In the classroom, one lamp on the teacher's desk made all the difference. Chalk traced words across the blackboard with clarity, and young minds stayed awake a little longer, their imaginations now extending beyond the daylight. Factories adapted first. Large buildings with tall ceilings lit from corner to corner. The rhythm of the machines no longer depended on the sun. Workers came and went on new schedules, some grateful for the hours, others wary of the endlessness. In the cities, electric streetcars began to appear. Headlamps cut through fog. Telegraph wires carried news faster than ever before. The world was beginning to hum with a new kind of energy, and yet, amid all the brilliance, people still marveled at the simplicity of it. A light that didn't flicker in the breeze, a room that stayed bright until someone turned it off. Children born into this new age would never know the fear of stumbling through dark hallways or lighting a lantern before sunrise. Their memories would be made in rooms that glowed with invention. Still, there were those who hesitated. Older generations who missed the soft flicker of gaslight, who found comfort in the rhythm of firelight and flame. But even they, over time, came to appreciate the ease of it, the way a single bulb could illuminate a whole room, banishing the cold edge of night. It was not just about invention, it was about vision, about seeing the world not as it was, but as it could be, brighter, safer, fuller of promise. Edison gave the world a way to keep going when the sun went down. But more than that, he gave them the freedom to dream longer into the night. As cities lit up and homes began to glow, America stood on the threshold of something vast, an age of industry and ingenuity, of invention and possibility. And somewhere in that gentle glow, the sound of children laughing, fathers reading aloud, mothers finishing one last stitch before bed, all under a light that never wavered. The dark still came, but it no longer closed the chapter. It simply turned the page. In the countryside and small towns of 1880s America, school did not come with rows of lockers, ringing bells, or vast campuses. Instead, it came with the soft creak of wooden floorboards beneath well-worn boots and the quiet hum of a coal stove in the corner. There, standing alone on a patch of land, often beside a pasture, sometimes tucked near a grove of trees, was the one-room schoolhouse. Weathered white siding, a bell in a small tower, maybe a flag waving stiffly in the wind. Children would walk there each morning, some from a mile away, others much farther, their shoes dusty or muddy depending on the season, their slates tucked beneath their arms, and lunch pails clinking with simple offerings, bread, a boiled egg, maybe an apple if they were lucky. There were no grade levels as we know them now. Inside, all ages sat together. 6-year-olds learning the alphabet beside 14-year-olds puzzling through fractions and American history. Desks were arranged in neat rows, their surfaces etched with initials carved during long afternoons. At the front of the room stood a blackboard, large and dusty, and beside it, the teacher's desk, often a second-hand item from a local merchant or carpenter. A globe, a Bible, a few precious books. No maps unless someone donated one. And always, the American flag, often handmade, hanging with pride. The teacher, more often than not, was a young woman barely older than her eldest students. She might have come from a neighboring town, or even grown up just down the road. Her salary was modest, paid partly in coins, partly in food or firewood, but she held a position of great respect. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and history, but also civics, manners, and morality. Lessons were recited aloud. Children stood to answer questions, hats off, hands clasped. Penmanship was practiced slowly and carefully, each letter a work of art. Outside the windows, horses would clip by pulling wagons. The sound of birdsong often drifted in, and on good days, the scent of fresh-cut hay. There were distractions, a fly buzzing too close, a younger sibling tugging at another's sleeve. But there was also a quiet sort of focus. School began at 8 and ended when the light began to dim, though often it was the chores at home that marked the real end of the day. Many students couldn't attend regularly. Harvest season pulled them back to the fields. Winters were harsh. Illness came without warning. But they came when they could. There were no school buses, just boots and pathways, no cafeterias, only lunch eaten on the front steps or under a nearby tree. No gymnasiums, but games of tag and stickball made the playground alive with laughter. And recess wasn't just play. It was freedom. It was a chance to stretch, to breathe, to imagine something beyond the blackboard and the spelling list. In that one room, children learned more than lessons. They learned patience, listening, respect. They saw their siblings shine at subjects they themselves struggled with. They watched younger students grow and older ones prepare to leave, maybe for high school in a distant town, maybe straight into work. For many, this small building was the beginning of dreams, of teaching, farming, inventing, raising a family, or perhaps just wanting more than what they'd known. And when storms came, literal or otherwise, it was often the schoolhouse that stood as a gathering place, a shelter, a symbol of continuity. In the evenings, the room would grow cold. The last of the chalk dust would settle. The teacher might remain behind, grading papers by lamplight, her shadow stretching long across the wooden floor. And outside, as dusk painted the sky with muted lavender and gold, the last children would make their way home, talking in low voices, tired, but full of the quiet pride that came from effort. The one-room schoolhouse may have been simple, but it held within it the heartbeat of a generation, a place where knowledge and community were passed, hand to hand, voice to voice, where learning wasn't just preparation for life, it was life itself. In nearly every small town across America in the 1880s, there stood a place that was more than just a shop. It was the general store, a gathering spot, a news hub, and for many, the beating heart of daily life. Set on the corner of Main Street, or tucked beside the post office, the general store welcomed folks of all ages and walks of life. Its wooden floors creaked beneath boots worn thin from farm work. A brass bell above the door jingled each time someone entered, announcing arrivals with a cheerful chime. Inside, it smelled of sawdust, tobacco, coffee beans, and sometimes, on a lucky day, fresh candy. Wooden barrels brimmed with pickles or dried apples, shelves lined with canned goods, kerosene, nails, ribbons, bolts of cloth. The counter stretched long and worn, where a storekeeper stood, often a man with suspenders, a tidy mustache, and a mind sharp as a ledger. Children would rush to the penny candy jars, noses pressed to the glass, pointing eagerly at peppermint sticks, licorice ropes, and lemon drops. Their mothers picked up sewing thread or weighed out sugar by the scoop. Fathers might ask after the latest shipment of tools, while neighbors lingered by the stove swapping stories about the weather, the crops, or the preacher's new sermon. There was no rush, no background music, just the sounds of conversation, the rustle of paper sacks, and the rhythmic ticking of the store's wall clock. Time seemed to move a little slower here, and then, one day, something new arrived, something fizzy, something brown and sweet and utterly mysterious. A drink that would, in time, become one of the most iconic symbols of American culture, Coca-Cola. But in the beginning, it was simply a curiosity. Delivered in wooden crates, chilled in coolers packed with ice, and poured from behind the soda fountain by a teenage boy with slicked back hair and a pressed white apron. The soda fountain itself, often placed at the back of the general store, was a marvel. Gleaming brass taps, marble countertop, tall glasses lined up like soldiers. Children would watch in fascination as the syrup was mixed, the seltzer hissed, and a perfect, bubbling drink appeared like magic before them. Coca-Cola was touted not only as a refreshment, but as a tonic, a delicious and refreshing cure for headaches and fatigue. Folks were skeptical at first, but intrigued, and once they tasted it, the crispness, the zing, the sweetness dancing across their tongues, they came back for more. It wasn't just about the flavor. It was about the moment. Two friends sharing a glass on a hot summer day. A young man nervously offering to buy one for the girl he liked. A father letting his son take the first sip while he watched with a grin. Coca-Cola became more than a drink. It became a ritual, a reason to linger, and in doing so, it added a new layer to the general store's magic. Where once the store had been a place of necessity, soap, flour, thread, now it was also a place of joy, a place where memories were stirred with each clink of glass. The storekeeper might grumble about sticky countertops and the younger folk loitering too long, but he knew. He saw the twinkle in their eyes, the shared laughter, the quiet friendships being formed one soda at a time. Some evenings, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the store prepared to close, the soda fountain would glow softly in the golden light. The clinking of spoons and glasses, the soft fizz still rising from half-finished drinks. It all felt like part of something bigger. A new era was arriving, slowly, one sip at a time. In that little store, beneath the shadow of oil lamps and tin ceilings, Coca-Cola began its journey, not as a global brand, not yet, but as a small wonder in a small town, a spark of delight on an otherwise ordinary day. And as the children wiped their sticky fingers, and the bell jingled once more, and the lanterns were turned low, the memory of that first sip lingered. It lingered in the hum of voices, In the glint of glass, in the warmth of shared smiles, it was the taste of something new, and yet somehow it already felt like home. Sunday mornings in the 1880s carried a kind of hush, not a silence of absence, but of reverence. The clamor of the week faded, replaced by the rustle of fabric, the creak of floorboards under polished shoes, and the soft hum of hymnals rehearsed under breath. The general store was closed. The fields were left unplowed. Even the trains ran less frequently. It was the Lord's Day. And more than that, it was a day to present oneself, and presentation mattered. In small towns and countryside homesteads alike, Sunday was not just about going to church. It was about being seen, and just as importantly, seeing others. From the youngest child to the eldest matron, everyone had their Sunday best, carefully set aside in the wardrobe all week long, protected from dust, protected from wear. Those garments were touched with a kind of sacredness. For the men, it might be a pressed woolen suit, often the only one he owned, a stiff collar that scratched a bit at the neck, a tie fastened by a patient wife, a hat brushed clean. For women, the ritual was more involved and more exacting. Corsets were laced tight, pulling in the waist to meet the ideals of the time. Long cotton chemises came first, followed by layers of petticoats, skirts, a high-necked blouse or bodice, gloves, and always, a hat, often adorned with feathers or ribbons, pinned securely atop carefully arranged hair. Young girls watched their mothers, learning how to lace, how to pin, how to smooth the pleats of a skirt just so. They waited their turn before the mirror, a small square of glass hung near a window, and fidgeted while their shoes were buttoned. And boys, well, they squirmed in starched shirts and tried not to tug at their suspenders, their cowlicks pressed flat with water and combs. The entire process took time. It wasn't rushed. It couldn't be. It was as much a part of Sunday as the hymns or the sermon itself. And while it may sound formal or even uncomfortable today, there was a beauty in it, a grace, a pride in showing up well-dressed, well-mannered, and ready to face the world, even if that world was just a white clapboard church at the end of a dusty road. As families stepped out their doors, they moved slowly. The sun always seemed gentler on Sundays, the sky wider, the birds quieter somehow. Horse-drawn buggies lined up outside the church. Laughter echoed across the lawn as friends greeted one another. Gloved hands waved. Elders nodded respectfully. And inside the sanctuary, wooden pews creaked beneath the weight of community. The corsets, though tight, were endured with poise. The suits, though warm, were worn with dignity. And when the organ swelled and voices rose, something transcendent filled the space. Faith, yes, but also fashion, also formality, a kind of shared promise that no matter how hard the week had been, no matter how humble the home or worn the shoes, one could stand tall on a Sunday morning. After church, families would gather for Sunday supper, a roast if one was lucky, fresh bread, maybe a pie cooling on the windowsill, and everyone would remain in their best clothes, at least until the evening. Some afternoons were spent visiting. Neighbors might stop by for coffee or to borrow a recipe. Others simply sat on their porches, fanning themselves, watching the world move slowly past in bonnets and boots. And then, at the end of the day, came the quiet unfastening, corsets unlaced, pins removed, buttons unbuttoned one by one, a slow return to softness, to breath, to home. Garments were brushed, folded, and carefully returned to the armoire. Gloves tucked into their boxes, shoes polished again, ready to wait another week. And as lamplight flickered on, casting warm amber shadows across the room, mothers gently combed out their daughters' hair. Fathers lit pipes and loosened collars. Children curled up on laps, their fancy clothes traded for nightshirts and woolen socks. It was the close of a ritual, the fading echo of reverence. And though some may remember the corsets as restrictive or the boots as stiff, many more remember the way they felt, walking hand in hand with loved ones, dressed in their finest, with heads held just a little higher. Because in that time, in that place, Sunday wasn't about extravagance. It was about effort, about bringing forth the best of oneself, not out of vanity, but out of respect for neighbors, for tradition, for the week behind and the one ahead. And so the Sunday clothes waited quietly in the wardrobe. Until next time, until the bell rang once more, until another morning bathed in silk, starch, and sunlight. As Sunday faded into twilight, families stepped quietly back into their homes, their voices lower now, their movements slower. The day's formality, the lace, the starch, the pressed collars, began to soften. Corsets were carefully unfastened, boots unlaced. The grandness of public presentation gave way to the gentle hush of private spaces. Inside, the rooms were dim, not dark, just dim in that cozy way, where the corners seemed to hold secrets and the glow of a single oil lamp could warm an entire room. Most households had just one or two lamps, often placed in the parlor or kitchen. The flicker of their flames danced across the wallpaper, bringing the walls to life with shadows that moved like whispers. There was no electricity yet, not in most homes. No television, no radio, no fridge humming quietly in the corner. Just the steady ticking of a mantel clock and the faint creak of wood expanding and settling in the evening air. In these moments after supper, families gathered, not because they had to, but because there was little else to draw them apart. They came together naturally, without the tug of a screen or the ping of a device. Togetherness wasn't scheduled. It was simply life. The dining table, cleared of plates and crumbs, might now hold a game of checkers or a mending basket. A mother sewed a button back onto a shirt while her youngest leaned against her shoulder, eyes heavy with sleep. A father read aloud from a well-worn book, perhaps the Bible, or a serialized novel clipped from the newspaper. His voice low, steady, like the wind rustling through autumn trees. Children sat on braided rugs, fiddling with carved wooden toys or sketching in notebooks by lamplight. Older siblings might help the younger ones spell out difficult words, pointing with patient fingers and soft encouragement. There was an intimacy to it all, a closeness that didn't need words. It lingered in the shared warmth of the stove, in the scent of cornbread still clinging to the air, in the sound of firewood crackling behind the hearth. Even the animals seemed to settle differently at night. Cats curled on windowsills. Dogs sighed at the foot of chairs, paws twitching in dream. Outside, the horses were stabled and still. The chickens roosted. The world, once noisy and bustling with wagons and footsteps, had quieted to a hush. It was a time for storytelling, for passing down family lore, sometimes exaggerated with a wink. Grandparents recalled how things used to be, even though, in truth, things hadn't changed all that much. But in the telling, the ordinary became magical. The time a tornado bent the barn door backward. The winter the well froze solid. The neighbor who danced in the snow in nothing but his long johns and boots. Laughter came easy in the lamplight. It echoed softly off the walls, never too loud, never brash, just enough to warm the room. Some families sang together, harmonies layered over the crackle of the stove. Hymns, folk tunes, lullabies passed down from generations. The kind of music that didn't require an audience, only hearts tuned to one another. And when the hour grew late, routines took over with gentle familiarity. The lamps were turned down one by one, water fetched for washing, nightshirts slipped on, beds turned back. In homes with many children, beds were often shared, 3, even 4 to a mattress, lying sideways to make room. Some huddled together for warmth, others lay awake a little longer, whispering about the day just lived or the dreams they hoped to dream. Parents checked windows, tucked in covers, and murmured soft prayers. Then they, too, surrendered to rest. Outside, the town was quiet. A few lamps still glowed in upstairs windows. The rest flickered out, leaving only the stars and moon to keep watch. Back then, evening wasn't just a part of the day. It was a sacred space, a time between labor and rest, between noise and silence. It held a kind of reverence, and though the rooms were humble and the lamps simple, there was something rich in that light, something that made the simplest acts, reading aloud, darning a sock, singing a song, feel like treasures. And as each home dimmed, one by one, the whole town seemed to exhale, a gentle, shared breath beneath the quiet hush of the 1880s sky. In a world before the hum of refrigerators, the buzz of electric lights, or the constant chatter of televisions, life in the 1880s was filled with a different kind of music. It was the music of the ordinary, the ambient rhythm of a country still finding its pace. Each sound carried weight, texture, and meaning. And in the quiet of lamplit evenings, when the world slowed just enough, one could truly hear it. It began at first light. The rooster's crow, sharp and certain, echoed through farm valleys and sleepy towns alike. Then came the creak of bed frames as children stirred, the splash of cold water into wash basins, and the clatter of cast-iron pans meeting stovetops. Morning had its own soundtrack, gentle but steady, like the turning of a page. As the sun climbed higher, the towns and cities awakened in chorus. Horses' hooves tapped against cobblestone, sometimes in hurried rhythm, sometimes in slow and thoughtful clip-clops. The iron wheels of wagons rumbled low, wooden axles creaking under the weight of milk cans, lumber, or produce. Vendors called out along the streets, their voices distinct and practiced, each with a melody of their own. Fresh bread, morning papers, rags for sale. Children darting between buildings laughed and shouted in bursts of wild joy, the sound bouncing between brick walls and wooden porches. Bells chimed gently above shop doors. Dogs barked, sometimes in greeting, sometimes in protest. Inside homes and workshops, the industrial pulse of the era added its own harmony. the gentle whir of a treadle sewing machine, the hiss of a steam kettle on the stove, the rhythmic thud of a hammer shaping horseshoes in a blacksmith shop. These were not just sounds. They were the soundtrack of labor, of purpose, of living, but perhaps the most unforgettable were the mechanical marvels that had just begun to emerge. In larger towns, electric streetcars clanged and rumbled down metal tracks, their wheels screeching around corners. Train whistles pierced the air from distant stations, their long, mournful tones lingering like echoes of longing. To some, they were a call to adventure. To others, a reminder of someone who had already gone. Music, too, found its place. On front porches and in parlors, families gathered around parlor organs or upright pianos. Children learned their scales as mothers gently corrected with warm smiles and light taps on the keys. Ragtime melodies, just beginning to make their way across the country, offered syncopated joy to those who had once known only hymns and lullabies. The fiddle was a favorite in many homes, its strings worn smooth, its body darkened by years of use. Played by a grandfather with weathered hands, or a young girl learning her first waltz, its sound filled the room with something both homespun and eternal. Even those with no instruments found rhythm in clapping hands, tapping feet, or the simple act of whistling while walking down the lane. On Sundays, church bells rang out over fields and rooftops. Their tones were clear, solemn, comforting. People paused to listen, hats in hand, as the chimes called the faithful to prayer and reminded everyone, regardless of belief, that time was sacred. And then there was the quiet, the most powerful sound of all. In the countryside, away from the clang of industry and bustle of towns, silence stretched wide like the land itself. Bird songs drifted from tree to tree. The wind rustled wheat fields in 1,000 gentle waves. A screen door creaked slowly open, then clicked softly shut. The world was alive, but it wasn't loud. It breathed. As dusk approached, the sounds changed once more. The village blacksmith cooled his forge, the final sizzle of red-hot iron and water marking the end of his day. Children were called in with gentle voices. The clatter of dishes and soft laughter filtered through open windows. A whip-poor-will called from the trees. Crickets began their chorus, slow at first, then rising in a steady symphony under the darkening sky. By nightfall, a different rhythm took over. The hush of footfalls on wooden porches, the low murmur of goodnight prayers, the final whisper of lamplight being turned down. Somewhere in the distance, a train passed, its distant rattle and whistle sounding more like a lullaby than an engine. And in that closing hush of the 1880s day, the town finally exhaled. No static, no digital noise, no beeping alarms. Just the heartbeat of life itself, subtle, sincere, and deeply human. These were the sounds of an era when silence was still full, and every noise had meaning. And as you listen, even now, perhaps you can hear it too. The faint clink of a spoon in a teacup, the far-off cry of a train, the steady breath of a world at rest. In the hush that followed the fading notes of a fiddle or the last vendor's cry, there remained a human longing for joy, for escape, for just a touch of wonder. Even in an era defined by hard work and early nights, people in the 1880s still sought moments that made their eyes widen and their hearts lift. And in those moments, entertainment was not a luxury. It was a gift. Long before movie screens flickered or radios crackled, amusement arrived by wagon, by word of mouth, or on foot. Humble and extraordinary all at once. It was the giddy chatter of children when the circus rolled into town, its painted wagons stirring dust on the main street. Folks gathered at windows or leaned over wooden fences, watching with wide-eyed awe as elephants marched by, followed by men in silk vests, twirling batons, and acrobats standing tall atop horses. That evening, the big top would rise on the edge of town, canvas flapping in the wind, ropes creaking as they tightened. Families arrived in their Sunday best, despite the weekday, drawn by the glow of gas lanterns and the scent of roasted peanuts. Inside the tent, there was magic. Real or not, it didn't matter. A juggler tossing fire into the air, a strong man lifting barrels with a roar, a tightrope walker inching across the sky. Each act brought laughter, gasps, and the kind of joy that lingered long after the show packed up and moved on. But not all wonder required elephants or drums. Sometimes it was found in smaller gatherings, where the stage was just a wooden platform, and the backdrop a painted curtain. In town halls or tiny theaters, local actors performed Shakespeare or recited poems from memory. Their voices echoed through packed rooms as lantern light flickered against the walls. The audience watched intently, their faces lit by admiration and candle flame. For those in rural areas, far from traveling shows or concert halls, there were still moments to be shared. On summer nights, neighbors gathered outdoors for stories passed down through generations, tales of love and loss, of ghosts and legends whispered near firelight. Someone might pull out a harmonica or a fiddle, and the night would swell with music and laughter, feet tapping against wooden porches or grassy fields. The songs weren't always in tune, but they were full of heart. And then there were the fairs, county fairs, harvest festivals, summer socials. These were celebrations of community, marked by pie baking contests, sack races, and ribbons pinned to the best ears of corn. The air buzzed with the mingling smells of fried dough and fresh hay, the din of conversation blending with the occasional neigh of a horse or a child's delighted squeal. At dusk, lanterns were strung from tree to tree, casting a golden glow over dancing couples and carousel rides that turned slowly to the rhythm of a mechanical organ. Even simple parlor amusements held their own kind of wonder. A stereoscope could transport someone to a faraway land, Paris, Egypt, or the Rocky Mountains, all in 3D with a flick of the hand. Magic lanterns projected moving pictures on the wall, shadows that danced and shifted like early cinema, and children sat enraptured as a grown-up performed shadow puppets, spinning stories against the lamplight with only their fingers. Board games, puzzles, charades. They filled long winter evenings with laughter and gentle competition. In some homes, an older child would read aloud from a penny novel or an illustrated magazine while the rest of the family listened. The only sound the occasional crackle from the fireplace or the turning of a page. There was a tenderness in this kind of entertainment, slow, deliberate, and shared. It wasn't about spectacle or noise. It was about presence. People looked one another in the eye. They laughed without distraction. They listened. They clapped not because they had to, but because something stirred in them. Some little flicker of joy, of admiration, of hope. And perhaps that's what made the entertainment of the 1880s so special. It wasn't consumed, it was experienced, together. As the night wore on and families made their way home, whether from a fair, a play, or a porch gathering, their hearts were full. The roads might have been dark, but they walked with lightness in their steps. In their minds, they carried images of flying trapeze artists, of glowing lanterns, of stories still echoing, and as sleep came, it was laced with dreams not of screens or applause, but of wonder, the kind that glows softly in the memory, like gaslight flickering on painted canvas. As the echoes of laughter faded from the fairgrounds and the warm glow of lanterns dimmed behind curtains, there remained a stillness, a quiet space where the heart could settle. In that quiet, another kind of connection came to life, one that didn't rely on voices or presence, but on ink, paper, and longing. Letters, in the 1880s, they were far more than messages. They were lifelines, laced with hope, burdened with sorrow, and wrapped in affection. A letter could carry across hundreds of miles what a person could not say face to face. It could hold a pause, a memory, a promise. And when words were carefully penned in looping script, each stroke deliberate and intimate, they became pieces of the soul, sent out into the world, in parlors and kitchens, on porches and by oil lamplight. People sat down with pen in hand and heart on sleeve. Mothers wrote to sons who had ventured west, chasing dreams or carving out farmland on prairie soil. Sweethearts, separated by trains and time, wrote of missing hands, familiar laughter, and the scent of home. Soldiers penned lines from distant outposts. Widows wrote to children long grown, and sometimes the letters were never sent at all, tucked into drawers, read and reread as private prayers on paper. Ink was often violet or deep blue, more permanent than pencil, more graceful than black. The words flowed slowly, carefully, with no delete button or second draft. Every page folded tenderly, every envelope sealed with a lick and perhaps a kiss. Some held dried flowers or strands of hair. Others carried tears that had blurred the lines. The journey of a letter was never simple. It might travel by horseback, rail, or stagecoach, changing hands again and again before arriving in a wooden mailbox or at the postmaster's window. Weeks might pass between writing and reading, but still, the wait was endured with anticipation. To receive a letter was to be reminded that you were thought of, that in someone's world you still mattered. For many young women, especially those in rural places, letters were where love began. Courtships often blossomed not over candlelit dinners, but through written words exchanged over months, sometimes years. One might imagine a young woman unfolding a letter with trembling hands, her heart fluttering at the sight of his name. The ink might be smudged in places where he'd hesitated, unsure of how to express affection, yet determined to try. She might write back by lamplight, choosing each word with care, knowing that miles away he would read her heart in every line. And then there were letters of loss. The death of a loved one often arrived in the form of a carefully worded envelope, addressed in shaky script. "We regret to inform you," or "It is with great sorrow." Those letters were folded more slowly, opened with dread, read with tears that refused to stop, and still, They were held close, pressed to the chest, stored in boxes lined with fabric, because even pain was better than silence. To grieve through words was to remember, and to be remembered, even in sorrow, was a comfort in itself. Some letters were written to those who would never read them: lost children, departed spouses, parents who'd passed too soon. They were whispered confessions, updates, or apologies. Letters that healed the writer more than they could ever reach the recipient. They were, in every way, sacred, and yet, for all the sorrow and distance, the letter was also a vessel of joy. Birth announcements, wedding invitations, poems copied by hand and sent to brighten a friend's day. These were celebrations wrapped in postage. Some envelopes smelled faintly of perfume. Others crackled with starch from carefully pressed pages, and all carried a kind of breath, proof that someone, somewhere, had taken the time to sit still and think only of you. Even children were part of the great exchange. School lessons included penmanship, not just for beauty's sake, but because it was how they would one day connect to the world. A child's first letter to a grandparent, clumsy and sweet, was an event to be treasured. Grandparents kept those in drawers for decades, unfolding them on quiet days when the house felt too still. By the end of the century, America was vast, and families were scattered, but the post tied them together. It was the quiet net holding relationships across distance, and the letter, so small, so delicate, was its heartbeat. As the world changed, telegraphs, telephones, and eventually voices carried across wires, the letter began to fade. But in the 1880s, it was everything. It was presence without touch, emotion without sound, and time, captured forever in the loops of a name and the closing line. Yours always. Some of those letters survive today, tucked between the pages of forgotten books or displayed in antique shops, their ink faded, but their emotions intact. Reading them is like stepping into someone else's moment, a young girl's hope, a father's farewell, a soldier's promise, and in that moment, just for a breath, you're not alone. As paper letters traveled from hand to hand, carrying hopes and heartache across the miles, some were written in the shadow of tragedy. And in the spring of 1889, the world watched as a peaceful Pennsylvania valley was forever changed by water, fire, and the unwavering resolve of a woman named Clara Barton. The day began like any other in the town of Johnstown. Nestled in a narrow river valley, it was a working-class community. Steel mills, modest homes, and families who had learned to live with the rains. That spring had been wet, too wet, and high above them, the South Fork Dam loomed, holding back a reservoir known as Lake Conemaugh. For years, people had whispered their worries. The dam was old, patched, imperfect, but life had to go on. Children played in muddy yards, mothers swept front porches, fathers walked to the mill with lunch pails in hand. Rain tapped steadily on rooftops, and the little town pressed forward, unaware that everything was about to change. On May 31st, 1889, the dam gave way. In a moment, less than an hour after the breach, a wall of water 40 feet high thundered down the valley. It moved with the power of a freight train, sweeping trees, homes, and entire lives into its path. There was no time, no warning, just a roar that swallowed the world. Some tried to run, others stood frozen, staring as the sky darkened with spray and the earth rumbled beneath their feet. When the water hit Johnstown, it carried with it not just debris, but an inferno. Gas from broken tanks and lanterns ignited the wreckage, transforming flooded streets into blazing rivers of fire and steam. Survivors spoke of bodies tangled in tree limbs, children clinging to floating doors, and horses screaming beneath the crush of splintered wood and twisted iron. A stone bridge trapped the debris, creating a kind of dam within the flood, and as the wreckage piled up, it burned. For hours, beneath a sky gone black. When the water finally receded, more than 2,000 souls were lost. Entire families were gone. Whole neighborhoods vanished. The air hung heavy with the scent of mud, smoke, and sorrow. It was into this ruin that Clara Barton stepped. Already 67 years old, she had lived through war, organized care for wounded soldiers, and founded the American Red Cross just 8 years earlier. When word of the Johnstown flood reached her, she didn't hesitate. Within days, she arrived with a team of volunteers, and she stayed. For months, she didn't just bring bandages or food. She brought order, compassion, purpose. She coordinated shelters, delivered supplies, and comforted the broken. She listened. She remembered names. She wrote letters for the grieving. She handed out blankets, not with pity, but with dignity. And when others left, she remained until the last displaced family had found their footing again. The townspeople called her an angel, but she didn't wear white or glide through streets. She wore boots, rolled up her sleeves, and worked tirelessly in the mud beside them. She saw not just disaster, but resilience. And because of her, the American Red Cross proved itself, not as a symbol, but as a force for healing. Through the long summer and into the fall, Johnstown slowly began to rebuild. Children returned to play on new steps. Mothers planted flowers in muddy soil. A town once torn apart by tragedy began to stitch itself together. Not perfectly, not quickly, but with quiet determination. And always Clara was there. She embodied something deeply American, something rooted in the 1880s spirit, that even when life crumbles, even when loss is too deep for words, someone will step forward. Not for glory, not for reward, but because it's the right thing to do. By the time she left, she had distributed over 25,000 relief packages, helped build new homes, buried the dead, and perhaps more importantly, she gave people a reason to believe in kindness again. For those who survived, the flood was a dividing line. There was life before it, and everything after. And though the years would carry them on, they never forgot. Not the roar of water, not the glow of fire, and not the woman who walked among them with quiet strength and fierce compassion. Today, the Johnstown flood is remembered as one of the deadliest disasters in American history. But within that darkness, there was light, a lamplight held steady by one woman's hand. And in her shadow, a nation learned what it meant to care for its own, not just in thought, but in action. And just like the letters written in violet ink, the memory of Clara Barton remains, soft, enduring, and deeply human. While the mills and cities buzzed with smoke and steel, far from the clang of industry and the rush of crowded streets, life on the farm moved to an older rhythm, slower, quieter, and shaped by the turning of the seasons. In the countryside of 1880s America, the day began not with alarm clocks or factory whistles, but with the first light filtering through gingham curtains and the crow of a rooster perched on the split rail fence, morning air was brisk and smelled of damp earth, hay, and the faint trace of wood smoke from the kitchen stove. Before breakfast, chores had already begun. The cows needed milking, hens fed, water pumped from the well, and kindling stacked into the stove. Children, some still rubbing the sleep from their eyes, were expected to lend a hand. Life didn't pause for fatigue. It flowed forward in cycles of effort and reward, rooted in necessity. Meals were hearty and made from scratch. Eggs gathered just minutes before. Biscuits rolled on a wooden board. Jam from the cellar. Coffee bubbled on the stovetop. The warmth of the hearth wrapped around the family like a blanket. And simple conversations carried meaning that no telegram ever could. The farm wasn't only a place of work, it was a world unto itself. Fields stretched beyond the eye's reach, amber in summer, brittle brown in winter, and emerald green in spring. They weren't just fields, they were the promise of survival. The success of the harvest determined the comfort, or hardship, of the year to come. Each season brought its own kind of labor. Spring was for planting, stooped backs and dirt-covered hands pressing seeds into waiting earth. Summer was long days beneath the sun, tending rows, mending fences, chasing chickens from the squash. Autumn meant harvest, corn in woven baskets, apples in barrels, wheat bundled and stacked with care. Winter was the silence, when the land rested and people did too, if only a little. Children on the farm grew up with a kind of freedom rarely found in the city. They climbed trees, chased fireflies, and carved whistles from willow branches. They learned to ride bareback and catch fish with string and safety pins. And though their toys were fewer and their time often borrowed by chores, there was magic in their play. Magic shaped by imagination, open skies, and the company of siblings or strays. There was a different kind of wealth here, not one measured in gold or banknotes, but in jars of canned peaches stacked neatly on pantry shelves, in rows of quilts folded with care, in the creak of a rocking chair that had held 3 generations. Neighbors were seldom near, but never far when needed. A barn raising could draw families from miles around. Laughter, music, and shared labor under the same sun. And when illness struck or weather turned cruel, word spread fast, and helping hands came without question or expectation. The home itself was often simple. 1 or 2 rooms, low ceilings, creaking floors. The kitchen was its heart, the place where bread rose in tin pans, where stories were shared over dishwater, where heat from the stove thawed cold hands after chores in the snow. Evenings settled gently. Lanterns were lit, their glow golden and soft against hand-sewn curtains. The Bible might be read aloud, or a fiddle might emerge, its song slow and bittersweet. Children lay curled on braided rugs, their heads against a sibling shoulder or a family dog. Outside, the wind sighed through the fields. Inside, time seemed to slow with each passing hour. Life on the farm wasn't easy. It was grueling, sometimes harsh. Storms could ruin a crop. Illness could take a child. A bad winter could test every reserve. But those who lived it knew its beauty, the deep satisfaction of honest labor, the quiet companionship of land and sky, the small joys that stitched themselves into a lifetime. And in that world, so far removed from the bustle of locomotives, tenement blocks and blazing arc lights, there was peace. A kind of peace that lived not in silence, but in steadiness, in knowing the rhythm of the land, the patience of planting, the joy of a calf's first steps, the smell of fresh-cut hay. In understanding that life, even when hard, could be full. As our story winds toward its end, we leave behind the fields, golden in the last light of day, and carry with us the sound of a screen door creaking closed, the hush of twilight, and the long shadows stretching across the porch. Soon, the lamps will be turned low, the fire banked for the night, and somewhere a child will press their ear to the chest of a ticking clock and listen to the slow, steady heartbeat of a simpler world. As the long day on the farm drew to a close, the golden hush of twilight settled gently across the land. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting long lavender shadows over fields that had been plowed, planted, and walked upon for generations. A light breeze moved through the tall grass, rustling it like whispers between old friends. Somewhere in the distance, a barn door creaked shut, and the low, satisfied murmur of cows bedding down filled the air. In the farmhouse kitchen, the last clatter of dishes quieted. A pot of stew, long simmered over the wood-burning stove, had been emptied and cleared away. The family now gathered in the front room, where the warm glow of an oil lamp softened the wooden walls. Children curled on a braided rug near the fire, listening as a grandfather slowly read aloud from the worn pages of a favorite book. His voice, low and rhythmic, seemed to echo the pace of life itself. Slow, steady, and full of care. Outside, the world hushed. Crickets began their nightly song, joined by the soft croaking of frogs near the creek. Fireflies danced across the yard like sparks from the lantern of some invisible traveler. The air smelled of cut hay and distant wood smoke, the comforting scent of a world winding down. A train horn called far off in the valley, low and lingering, a lullaby carried on the wind. Even in the towns, where streets were lined with gas lamps and shop fronts closed one by one, the night moved in with quiet dignity. A constable made his evening rounds, tipping his hat to neighbors closing up porches. The bakery's last loaves cooled on open shelves. In boarding houses, the scrape of chairs and hush of footsteps marked the end of another day in the bustling century. Upstairs in a tenement, a mother tucked her youngest child into bed, humming a lullaby her own mother had once sung in the old country. In a town mansion, a parlor pianist played something slow and wistful, letting the notes drift out the open window into the sleeping streets. In every corner of 1880s America, from homesteads on the prairie to the busy corners of Chicago, the night was settling in. This was a world without electric clocks or screens glowing into the dark. Time was kept by the rhythm of the earth itself. People rose with the sun, and when it set, they returned to the softness of home, to oil lamps and bedtime prayers, to blankets heavy with hand-stitched care, and as they rested, their dreams were filled with the world they were helping to build, brick by brick, field by field, a world of telegraphs and typewriters, of horses and hymnals, of hope carried across oceans and born again on factory floors. There was hardship, to be sure, and sorrow, and endless labor, but also a quiet courage, a belief in something better, a sense of being part of something larger than themselves. Looking back now, through the veil of more than a century, that world feels like a dream, a sepia-toned memory where everything moved slower, sounded softer, felt simpler. It was not a perfect world, but it was a world of deep roots, of hands in the soil, of faces lit by firelight, of stories passed down by voice alone. And as we drift now into this final stretch of our journey, perhaps you can hear it, the gentle rhythm of a rocking chair on a front porch, the rustle of trees outside an open window, the tick of a mantel clock keeping time with your breath. Maybe you can see the stars through that 19th century window hanging above a quiet town where not much more will happen tonight. And maybe that's just fine, because there's comfort in the stillness, in knowing that tomorrow will come, and it will begin much the same, with sunlight through the curtains, with a rooster's call, with bread in the oven, and boots by the door. So for now, let us linger a little longer in this quiet place. Let the night wrap around you like an old quilt. Let the sounds of that far-off time lull you to sleep. The distant hoofbeats on a dirt road, the creak of a weathered floorboard, the sigh of wind through pine and cottonwood. Let go of the noise of now. For just a little while, let yourself rest in the warm and wondrous hush of 1880s America, a time when dreams were stitched by hand, and even the silence had a story to tell. And as your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts begin to wander, may you carry with you the calm of a simpler time, the hush of a world lit by lamplight, the steadiness of days shaped by weather and work, the comfort of knowing that even in the quietest corners, you are not alone. From all of us here at Sleepy Town Radio, thank you for spending this evening with us. Wherever you are, under city lights or country stars, we wish you rest, peace, and the sweetest dreams. Good night.